needle exchange or even treatment sites, but you have to ask the question specifically about what they're using and how they defeat these mechanisms. And then that gives you the blips. That's what our recent experience certainly tells us.
Sijal, I mean, it almost sounds like you're trying to see if the needle moves on abuse and addiction in general. And that's a hard thing to do. And, you know, certainly what I've seen now in my 50 years of doing this, that you put something that blocks one drug either as at the source or something else, and it shifts. The whole problem shifts to another drug that's more available. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in the same class. It can be another class. And we see these patterns. If you look over the past 50 years, there's stimulant, then there's depressant, then there's stimulant, depressant. These patterns have been persistent for a long period of time. You know, in the overall abuse and addiction area, it's very hard to move that needle. And I agree what was said earlier, that one of the places where you might be able to get some information about the abuser population is syringe exchange programs, other programs that are dealing with harm reduction, where you can ask some questions and get some data. You know, whether those data are biased in some way based on what's going on in a specific area, but at least you're getting some data on that. And in the patient population, certainly you're aware of the development of the prescription opioid misuse abuse questionnaire, the POMAC, and we're looking at validation of that instrument, but that hopefully, if it's validated, could be an instrument that's used with the patient population, and maybe some variation could be used with the non-patient population. But I'm just concerned about the idea of moving the needle on drug abuse in general. That's a heavy needle to move, and you need a lot of power, and I don't think you're going to move it.
Dan Budd at CDC. I guess I was gonna, second that thought that to try to change all outcomes of overdose and death across both patients and non-patients might be a lot to ask for these products. And then to focus on the issue of the effectiveness in preventing insufflation and injection, it might be too rare occurrence over too long a term to really have a study that demonstrates effectiveness there. So then we got to this point of, you know, looking for blips, essentially safety signals, but that turns this whole paradigm on its head. Now we're not looking for effectiveness, now we're doing, you know, post-marketing safety surveillance, and a lot of folks here have a lot of experience in post-marketing safety surveillance, and that's with outbreak detection, it's with MedWatch reports, it's with, you know, a whole different set of tools, and it's a totally different question. And so I think this, you know, presumption of effectiveness, you know, turns everything upside down. But I don't know if we have, you know, I guess we have these phase 1, 2, 3 type studies, but I don't know the phase 4 studies, but I'm not, you know, integrally involved in this field, so I don't know for sure.
All right, I think we need to move on to the audience participation. So please try to focus on your comments on this session's topic, which is causal inference and control for confounding. You'll be given 3 minutes to talk. A light system will keep time and notify you when it's time to hurry up, when the yellow light is on, and when to stop when the red light is on. So audience, please, before you start, please provide your name, state your disclosure, and provide your comments. Thank you.
Hi, it's Steve Butler again from Inflection. I'm like a frequent flyer at an ER room. Just a couple of comments here, and maybe this reflects some of my misunderstanding about the how the claims work for the different categories. But, to come up with a sort of permanent claim, it seems like that could be difficult, especially for new products or products that don't have a pre-version, and any product that has low prescription availability, because that's going to be the obvious explanation for a low, any low rates of abuse. And what we found in looking at substance abuse treatment centers is kind of what people have started talking about, these blips. We start seeing the blips almost right away. Just here and there, might be one for 1 month and one for another month. And then, and we've seen this over and over again for drugs like Zohydro and Nucynta, even Exalgo. It's been on the market for a while. So it's, maybe this is ridiculous, but it seems to me there's, to give the manufacturer something like a temporary or pending Category 4 rating that could be removed if a drug was starting to look like it was going to be a problem. The other thing might be to look at some of these data that we have in terms of whether there's we haven't done this yet, but in terms of whether there's a kind of pattern of abuse as the prescription availability gets larger, because that's what we're really interested in, is if the prescriptions start to really go up, then do we have some kind of problem that we didn't expect? So we want to know, is this ADF going to create a problem? And my last comment is about the route of administration aspect of all this. One of the things we've found is that it's good if you have a few abuse cases, but if you have few abuse cases, then you don't have sufficient power to come up with a stable sort of route of administration profile. So you can see how people are using it, but you have such wide confidence intervals that you can't be confident that what seems to be a low injection rate, for instance, is in fact low. So I think I've used my time. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul Copeland from Purdue. Share Dr. Butler's comment about being a frequent flyer. Apologize about that. So a couple of points. Firstly, about ITS versus means analysis. So Dr. Degenhardt's data from Australia shows that there's an inherent difference in the abuse rate of a product that's visible relatively quickly. That's inherent in the risk of abuse of that product. With an interrupted time series analysis that may go for 5 years, what's been measuring then is whether there's an interaction between the abuse deterrent formulation and secular interventions, other interventions. And there's no reason to expect that an abuse deterrent formulation would continue to have an increasing effect over time. It inherently has a different rate of abuse, and that's picked up in a relatively short period of time, as long as the product has had time to work through the system. If we start to look at trends over time for 5 years, it's confounded by a lot of other secular trends, and then the ability to tease out secular trends from the abuse deterrent formulations effects gets weaker and weaker. And then it starts to measure this question of interaction of the abuse deterrent formulation and the secular trends. In terms of the Bayesian model that Dr. Throgmorton mentioned, we think that would be a very helpful approach to, because if we can either look at each study individually and use a frequentist approach and determine, does this have a 1 in 20 chance of being explained by chance alone? But if there's been Category 1, Category 2, Category 3 studies that are in the label, the preclinical work, now we're going to the real world evidence, then we have a number of different studies. Each of them has their limitations, but if we include them, but they all add to the Bayesian prior, and so the Bayesian prior builds over maybe 15, 20 different studies in different settings, in different environments, in different countries at different times. So that Bayesian approach we think is maybe complex but worth looking at. In terms of differentiating between different interventions, so one of the things that's been plaguing OxyContin is that a huge intervention occurred, which was the Florida pill mill and pill mill legislation and the PDMP. And so the question is, what was OxyContin versus what was the Florida pill mill? And one of the ways of disentangling those is by looking at supply versus demand, because the Florida pill mill intervention was essentially a supply. It shut down the pill mills. That's the same thing with PDMPs. They're really shutting down supply. From economics, we know when the supply goes down, the price goes up. The diversion goes up. So, for example, when there's in Florida, when there's bad rains and the orange juice isn't made, the oranges kind of rot. The price of orange juice goes up because there's less of it, and so that the supply side interventions increase demand, increase street price. In contrast, abuse deterrent formulations are a demand side. They reduce the demand. If they're effective, they would reduce the demand for that product. So a reduction in demand would decrease price of that particular product and decrease diversion. And so the diversion approach becomes a very good way a useful way to disentangle those two. We can also look at difference in timing. The Florida intervention occurred 1 year later than the OxyContin reformulation. And the first thing we see is the reduction in prescriptions for 80 milligrams, the highest tablet strength of OxyContin, where we see no change for the 10 milligrams. So the high versus the low dose prescriptions becomes a useful way to disentangle these interventions.
Well, thank you very much for your comments. We have one more audience, and then after this, we'll go to a break.
Hi, my name's Dr. Tracy Main. I'm the head of medical affairs strategic research at Purdue and also a board member of the National Pharmaceutical Council. Perhaps I'm speaking more to a future state, but once there is a single drug, a single opioid that has this established as category 4 within the label, much of this complexity then disappears. It no longer becomes needing to do more complicated time series, but a simple propensity score match compared to a product that has an established rate can then be used for all future products. And I'm thinking with the COX-2s, one no longer had to have other groups involved. One could simply compare it to naproxen. So at least on a go-forward basis, once this is established within the label of a single product, many of these complexities simply go away and you can simply do a product-to-product concurrent comparison. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and then Mark and I are going to try to wrap up and have a discussion about all the ideas we heard today. So if we could reconvene at 3 o'clock, that'd be great. Thanks.